It's my pleasure to be joined by Representative Julianne Young from House. Start again. It's my pleasure to be joined by Representative Julianne Young from District 30 in the House of Representatives. Without any further ado, Representative Young, can you tell me about yourself? How did you get to the point where you decided to run for office, and what's life been like since then?
Sure, Brian. Boy, how did I get to the point where I decided to run for office? Um, I'm a mom. I've got 8 sons and 2 daughters, and I'm also someone who really, really loves to read. I love to study. I love to write. I really enjoy teaching, and I did a lot of reading and studying when my kids were younger, just about America and the fundamental principles of America. And I just fell in love with this beautiful country that we have and this representative form of government and our Constitution. And then, as you know, the more you learn and you look around, and I started to recognize how far away we were from some of those principles. And I really started trying to make a difference first just in my local community. And I never really thought that I would run for office. I was happy being a citizen activist, just trying to make a difference from where I was. But I saw a need and I decided to throw my hat in, and it's been 6 awesome years. I've learned so much, and we've really been able to do some great things. I love serving, even though it wasn't ever something that was on my radar. There was one other question. What was the other question, Brian?
Oh, well, just, open-ended. What's in your background that brought you to this place? How do you see your role in the legislature?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So I am a person that doesn't have a lot of political ambition. I'm not interested in climbing the pole. I just want to make a difference. And I really like to get work done. But the other thing that I think has been a benefit to my background as a mom is that I really like people to get along. And I really like to build relationships. And that's been a huge benefit to me as we've tried to pass good policy, because I find that I can respect people and I can build a good relationship with them, even if I don't agree with them all the time. And that comes in pretty handy because sometimes we work on issues that we have in common, and other times we might disagree on them, but there's always another opportunity to work on something else. And so keeping those good relationships, even when you disagree, has been really important.
One thing I've noticed in the couple of years that I've been watching the legislature is I really appreciate your ability to debate and, really concisely and um, accurately explain a subject as you're whether asking questions of testifiers in committee or speaking on the floor. Does that come from your years of reading and teaching? And um, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that it does. You know, when you understand the guts of something, it's a lot easier to ask questions about the mechanics. But I think the other piece of it is that because I've spent so many years as a mom, you learn to explain things in really simple ways. And and you want to help everybody understand. I had a fun experience last night. I had a cottage meeting where I had a family with a bunch of little kids show up, and it was fun to be able to explain to them, what's the House and what's the Senate and what's the JFAC committee. And so we had a whole cottage meeting where talking about budgets and the changes that we've made to the budgeting process was explained on a level that the 8-year-old and the 12-year-old could understand, and they were catching the vision, and that was really fun.
I think there's a very fine line between talking down to people and talking to people in a way that they can understand. And, some people fall on one side, but I've appreciated your ability to explain things well.
Yeah,
Over,
thanks, Brian.
so you're in District 30, which is, over on the east side, um, Butte County, Bingham County, looks very large, very empty. Just on the map itself. Obviously, there's towns and cities and things. What are some of the unique challenges of your district, and what are you hearing from people as you campaign?
Yeah, we have a lot of agricultural area, a lot of ag land and farm families. And I think one of the biggest concerns going into this next year is the water situation. And that's something that we're going to continue working on and looking for ways to build consensus and support for good policy. Um, that's not an area that you typically think of when you think of red, white, and blue and American freedom and all of that. But it really is fundamental. And that's a resource that is our responsibility as a state to allocate. And it's absolutely essential to people's ability to make a livelihood. And so there's a lot of good things that can be done. And I'm hoping that we can see some progress in some of those areas because we are sending more water out of the state down the river unallocated every year than the shortage.
Hmm.
So if we can be more proactive in actually figuring out how to beneficially use that resource in the interest of our state as a whole, then that will go a long ways towards solving a lot of the crises that we're facing. Not that the crisis is manufactured, but the crises can be solved if we
Mhm.
will.
That's one of them. One of those issues where we have a debate over the role of government. Do we just go full libertarian? It's just to protect life, liberty, and property, or are there things the government can and should do? And water is really an interesting area because you got this aquifer underneath everybody, but you can one person on their own property can affect what happens to other people, and especially when you have big farms or big you know factories or whatever else uses water. I know that data center that they were going to put in Kuna for Facebook was supposed to end up using tons of it, but that's on hold for now. How you know how do you come at that issue philosophically when it comes to water rights or anything else that's a common possession that the government needs to mediate?
Yeah, so the principle that's been established over time has been first in time is first in right. And so if you go back to when the first settlers came to Idaho, and there's this beautiful Snake River flowing through the valley, and whoever got there first had a right to the water in the river. And if somebody else came along, then they could go ahead and stick their straw in the river too and pull water out. But they couldn't take the water that belonged to the guy that was there first. That was the fundamental idea. And that's still a good principle. It's just that as we've gotten more straws in the river, and now we've expanded it beyond just the water in the river to the aquifer, which complicates things because we don't really understand the aquifer, and we need to. Um, we find ourselves in a situation where we're questioning whether there's enough to go around. And what I really believe is that if we can capture the water that's flowing out of the state unallocated and hang on to that, whether that's recharge, whether that's reservoirs, whether that's just better conjunctive management, so that when we have lots of water in the spring, we're recharging, and when we don't, then we're hanging on to it. We have options. And that's really important because if they make a water call this year, they could cut off as many as 80% of the groundwater irrigated ag acres in eastern Idaho, which would be absolutely devastating. So, yeah, you heard me right. I see
Well,
your face.
what would cause something like that to happen?
The director determining that if they don't cut off that many groundwater acres, then there won't be enough water coming out of the spring into the river
Hmm.
to benefit other parts of the state. Yeah, kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's you need someone to come in and mediate this and make sure everybody has access to these resources. But at the same time, like they say of the government, if the federal government were put in charge of the Sahara Desert, there'd be a shortage of sand in a few years. So you got to be very careful with that, I suppose.
Right, right. And the principle of first in time, first in right, and telling someone they can't pump water if they're taking it from the guy in front of them, that's a good principle. But if you only rely on reactive management strategies and you don't choose to be proactive, like the early pioneers built a lot of canals and reservoirs and all that kind of stuff to distribute and hang on to the water, we can't just forget that. We have to continue building the kind of infrastructure and creating the kind of storage opportunities that are going to allow us to maximize the resource. The other thing that happens is when it goes out of state unallocated, pretty soon someone comes along and says, oh, Idaho didn't need that water.
Hmm.
It
What
belongs to Oregon or
ooh,
California.
what if
So,
we've got the Snake River. What if in Washington they decided to just utilize all the water and then it just dries up in our state?
well, we are upriver in in
Oh yeah,
Idaho.
backwards.
So,
Okay, I'm
so as long as we use the resource,
okay over in Wyoming if they just block it off. Yeah,
yeah,
the
there's some
so
complications
yeah,
with that.
so we could actually impact Washington and Oregon in that way. Is Yeah, I got my brain turned around, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's complicated issue. What are some other issues that maybe aren't so complicated that you've come across in the
Oh,
legislature?
you know, as a mom, I have worked on a lot of issues, but it's the family issues that really speak to my heart. And I just am so grateful that I've had the chance to be a mom and have a family. And I think it's really important that we continue to protect women and men as women and men. So one of our big wins this last legislative session was a definition of male and female, because you can't have any sex specific policies to protect women if you don't know what a woman is. And so that was a big thing. And it's interesting because philosophically it goes even deeper than the nuts and bolts of bathrooms and sports and all of these things, because we have historically honored the family as the traditional unit of society. But first, we started by eroding the definition of marriage. Well, now we're eroding the definition of male and female. And so we're a step beyond the argument of marriages between a man and a woman to men and women don't even exist as a concrete category. And so it just continues to further erode the ability to define and to protect the traditional family in the law, too.
So I spent a lot of my time watching the legislature this year in the State Affairs Committee, where a lot of these bills came up relating to the family and the definitions of male and female. And obviously, I don't know if I'd say a lot of opposition, but there was some outspoken opposition. Um, you know, the I guess it's just bad luck that the capital happens to be in Boise, where a lot of the people who would oppose that kind of legislation live, and so they're always there every day. Same folks getting up and sharing why gender is a spectrum and we can't define male and female, and why we should do um, public funds for gender transitions and things like that. It does seem like our culture is really moving away from the what used to be truths that we all took for granted. Men are men, women are women. There's no in between. Marriage is man and woman. Children need a father and a mother. How do we, as a state, and you in the legislature, how do we hold that line when it seems like the culture is moving very far away from that?
I feel like, at least in my district, the vast majority of people are still there. But I think one of the challenges that we do face is, for example, in this election cycle, my opponent has criticized my strong conservative stance on social policy as wasteful and unnecessary, and comments like that's not relevant here in Idaho. That's something that is a concern in big states back east, or maybe California, but not Idaho. And so that's a waste of time. And having been in Boise for 6 years, as you're saying, it's very clear that these issues are relevant to the state of Idaho. And the other thing that's important to note is that we can't sit around and wait for them to get ahead of us. We need to be ahead of the game and define the rules ourselves instead of waiting for someone else to undefine them and then try to fix it after the fact. So I think just being aware, even though the vast majority of the state is conservative and does hold those traditional values, that we can't take it for granted.
That's something I heard a lot, that when people would debate against a bill, they would say, well, this isn't happening in Idaho. This isn't an Idaho problem. We need Idaho solutions for Idaho problems. And to me, it struck me as a little naive, because if your neighbor comes down, say you live on the coast and your neighbor comes up and says, hey, my house just got covered in a tsunami, you need to run. You don't say, well, that's not happening here. Do your due diligence, find out, okay, what is actually the truth, but take the steps you need to protect your family. Um, how how do you convince people that these things are a problem, even if they might not see them in their own communities, or even if they don't see obscene materials in their own libraries or woke indoctrination in their own public schools? How do you convince people that it is a problem that needs to be solved?
Well, one thing that I like to do is just go back to principle, because whether you think it's happening there or whether you don't, the question is, do you think that it's okay to give graphic sexual content to kids? I mean, really, is that okay or is that not okay? And if it's not okay, then we ought to protect kids against being exposed to graphic sexual content, especially with taxpayer dollars in public institutions. And it's the right thing to do. If it's not a problem, that's great. The law won't have an impact, but at least it provides a protection. If it is a problem, because I hear the opposite, sometimes people will make both arguments. It's not a problem, and it's such a huge problem that it's going to cost us thousands of dollars to address it, right? And we hear the same arguments coming out of the same person's mouth back to back. Either it's not a problem and the law won't have an impact, and we've done the right thing by protecting kids, or it is a problem. And if it's really going to be that expensive, we had a big problem and it's a good thing we fixed it.
Yeah, that makes sense. You also hear the third argument is that it's a good thing that it's happening. Usually Republicans won't say that. Usually that's what the Democrats say, but um,
Mhm.
it moves seamlessly between those arguments, and every one of them is designed to stop you from actually doing anything to stop it.
Yeah. Yeah. It is something that's kind of hard for people in my district sometimes to understand that there really are people that think it's a good thing and that it's okay. But you're absolutely right, because I've talked to them.
So your district, Eastern Idaho has a reputation for being more moderate when it comes to Republicans, more, you know, more likely to embrace expanding government spending, more likely to not want to do anything about social issues like libraries and schools and families. Uh, yeah, there you are in the middle of it. Um, how is that worked out? Are you just more able to communicate your message to voters and make sure people get out and vote for you?
I think that the thing that has really given me the ability to advocate for those things is the fact that I have a large grassroots base of moms and dads that get it and that are passionate about it. And I think a lot of people um, really do have those values, but it's just not the popular thing to talk about. Right. So I think getting that message out to ordinary moms and dads that do care about their kids, that do believe in the traditional family, that in their core really are conservative, but maybe they're just busy taking care of their family
Mhm.
and they didn't have political ambitions any more than I did. And they're not the ones out there in the spotlight. But I give them someone to support and someone that shares their concerns and their values.
Interesting. I mean, if there's some, magic formula, then I'm sure everybody else would be clamoring for it. But it's just the same old boring. Get out and talk to people, and you know, recruit
It's
people.
work. It's work every election cycle.
Yeah,
It's work.
you gotta
Yeah.
gotta put in the work to get the results, I suppose.
Yeah.
Uh, Shifting gears a little bit, one big issue that's been going around is schools, school choice, public schools. Um, the House hasn't seen a school choice, money following the student bill yet. There was one in the Senate last year that was defeated, and then one in a House committee this year that was defeated for a tax credit. So, you know, big open-ended question. What else do we need to do for public schools to help them be better? And would you like to see any form of money following the student to alternative options? And if so, what would that look like?
Sure. So as I mentioned, my degree's in education. I'm a teacher, but I never actually taught as a job. I finished my degree after I had kids at home, um, and stayed home with my kids. But I do care a lot about education. I'm one of those people that will geek out reading educational philosophy books too. And I really appreciate the vision behind having a public system of education as it was originally envisioned. And I think it's really important to maintain that because not every family has the ability to provide what their child needs in terms of education. And our whole society does benefit because we have that resource available. So I want that resource to be supported. And I also want it to be student-centered. I want it to be parent responsive, and I want it to be community-driven, which means it reflects the values and the priorities of local communities as much as possible. And I think that we've gotten away from that more and more in America, but anything that we can do to return to that kind of vision for education, I think helps us. The other thing that I've thought about a lot in terms of school choice is that, of course, not every child is going to have a good experience in their local public school. It's impossible to have a one size fits all model. And so if we accept that as a fact, and we also accept as a fact that generally speaking, a parent is the one who's best able to identify and meet the needs of a child. And then we also accept that society as a whole benefits every time you give a child a solid educational foundation. Then it only makes sense that you would provide a way to meet the needs of families and kids that maybe public school isn't their best option. And then the next question is, okay, so if we're going to provide an alternative, what's the best way to do that? My favorite way to do it is a tax credit. I love the tax credit idea because it goes to the parent, not to the institution, which means that we eliminate a lot of these questions about whether the government is supporting a particular kind of religious faith or anything else. We let the parent direct where the funding goes. The other thing that I like about the tax credit is that it happens after the fact. And I know some people see that as a downside because they say, well, that's going to make it more difficult for some families to ever change what they're doing because they don't have the money up front. And I recognize that, but I also see a benefit in that when the money comes first, it's easier for somebody to attach strings to it in terms of what can be provided. When the money comes after the fact, all you need is a receipt that proves that it fulfilled whatever the educational objective or requirement was. And if you've done that, then you get your tax credit. And there's less of an ability for government to manipulate the details of what happens with that educational option. I can see you have questions. You
Oh,
look like the wheels are turning, Brian.
oh, that sounds great. How do we get that through the House? It,
Oh,
died in committee last year. There was a lot of opposition to it. People who are worried that any form of money following the student, even if it comes from a completely different pot of money, will harm the public schools. Even the idea that giving parents an incentive to do alternative forms of schooling will harm the public schools.
yeah. I think just a lot hinges on this election cycle. It depends on who we get back. So if this is an issue that's important to people, it's a good question to ask the folks who are candidates for office. It will make all the difference. Idaho's one of the few red states that still doesn't have an educational choice option for families. And I think we ought to get it done. Um, I do think that it can be done very reasonably without harming public education. I think there's good research that actually shows that it benefits public education, and that makes sense to me. Um, one of the things that really kind of surprised me, honestly, when I was working on my education degree was when I took my educational philosophy class at ISU. And I had this awesome old professor called Dr. Gates. He was like the epitome of the old goat professor with his white hair and his sports jacket. And he, I learned so much about all the different approaches to education. And there are so many different objectives that you can have so many different ways to approach the student, so many different beliefs about the nature of the student and the role the student plays and the role the teacher plays. And yet we have this one size fits all model that doesn't really give us an opportunity to explore alternatives. And yet, without the opportunity to explore alternatives, we don't see the same kind of progress that we might see otherwise, because nobody ever challenges the status quo. Um, so I think that just the innovation that could happen with school choice, and I think of innovation in terms of how you meet the needs of students with disabilities, or how you create incredible engineers, or scientists, or whatever objective you might choose to pursue. Um, you know, if you go back to the founding generation, they had some ideas about the Greek trivium and classical education and teaching people to think and reason. And, you know, that could be a focus in somebody's educational model. And all these things would give us opportunities to begin to see the fruits of whatever these other ideas are. But honestly, I don't see a lot of those ideas ever taking off unless families have resources to point in those directions. And I don't think it has to be the full amount that we send to a public school student. I think it could be less. But I do think that the cost of actually running a quality micro school or private school is substantial enough that in most parts of the state, nobody will be able to afford to run those kinds of institutions without some kind of option for families to have some support. And they do pay taxes.
Mhm.
And if we're reimbursing them for real expenditures, then it eliminates any argument that this money is just being wasted, because we can see the educational expenditure and we can verify that it took place.
I figure it's the 21st century. I'm old enough to remember when that phrase, portended, great advances and changes in the way we do things. Um, but the people who are, invested in the current system want to see the current system promulgated. They don't want to see anyone mess with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Oh,
I don't think we have to dismantle it, but I do think that if we give people options, that it probably will start to change on its own, because people will try things that will work.
yeah. It's a give people opportunities to try things and see what works, and then
Mhm.
adopt whatever seems to work best. It makes sense to me. Makes sense to you. It's got to get enough people, other people to whom it makes sense to actually make it happen, though. Uh, Shifting gears a little bit, one thing I've obviously noticed is that here in Idaho, there's some significant debates within the Republican Party about a lot of things, about the nature of the party itself, how involved should it be in um, promoting conservative ideas, the relationship between the party and the voters, the party and the legislators. A lot of these counties and districts have, called their legislators to the carpet and says, you're not following the platform. And that's obviously created some contention on both sides. Uh, as the, you know, liaison of the House to the Idaho GOP, I assume you work closely with the party on, trying to get legislative priorities through. How do you see the relationship between the party, the lawmakers, and the voters, and how can we unite once again? Is it even possible?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that's been interesting to listen to is the discussion about Ronald Reagan Republicans and the Big Tent philosophy, and the Big Tent Party. So this is something that's been used by my opponent and David Cannon's opponent to promote the idea of open primaries. And what was interesting to me is that when I looked up Ronald Reagan's landmark speech on the Big Tent Party, and you actually read it, he doesn't say that we should abandon our principles and throw open the doors and let anybody who wants to come into the tent. What he says is, We are united within this tent by timeless core principles. And for those of us within the tent who hold those principles, we might sometimes have other disagreements about the methods that we use to support those principles or about the people who are in charge of the party. But we can't let those things, the methods and the leadership questions, become more important to us than the principles that unite us. Because if we do that and we fight each other within the group who share those principles, we actually harm our ability to advocate for those principles in November. So he said, keep focused on your principles, advocate for those, and make sure that we together are as strong as we possibly can be to advocate for those against those who disagree with us in November, or we will never succeed. That's what he said.
I see a lot of debates within this primary, especially in places where there's, say, a more moderate Republican incumbent and then two conservative challengers, uh, where the same, two different people can agree on 99% of principles, but they have significant disagreements about, methods, strategy, but also sometimes it's just personal. Sometimes, one person has rubbed some others the wrong way, and so they go over here, and you end up with these factions. And the end result is that a conservative district elects a moderate lawmaker. Um, I don't know. That's something I've been exploring as I've been having these conversations, is how to bridge that gap, how to really communicate and get back down to those core principles. What are those core principles? How do we know what's what's an important principle and what's something maybe on the outside?
Yeah, Brian, if you give me 2 seconds, let's see if I can find this real fast,
Yeah.
because I pulled some excerpts out of Ronald Reagan's speech and they were beautiful. Let me see here.
While you're looking for that, just speaking of Ronald Reagan, it's ironic to me that when he was first running in 76 and in 1980, the party establishment hated him. He was too conservative. He was too reckless. He was going to drive voters away. He was extreme. But then once he won and had a successful 2 terms and became enshrined in our Mount Rushmore of Republicans, now everybody wants to claim him as their own and say, oh, we're Reagan
Right.
Republicans.
Right. Okay. So here's a speech from here's a quote from Ronald Reagan in this speech. He says, "In our tent will be found those who believe that government was created by we the people. The government exists for the convenience of the people, and we can give to government no power we do not possess as individuals. That the citizen does not earn to support the government, but supports the government so that he may be free to earn. That because there can be no freedom without law and order, every act of government must be approved if it makes freedom more secure, and disapproved if it offers security instead of freedom." Isn't that beautiful? I wanted to memorize that. He does such a great job of capturing this fundamental idea of what is the proper role of government in a beautiful way. And those are the kind of principles that I think can unite people. But it's interesting, the people who scream the loudest about being Reagan Republicans and big tent Republicans have their pitchforks out when it comes to people who actually adhere to those conservative principles. As you said, just as they labeled Ronald Reagan as extreme, lots of ordinary folks that just want to be involved, just want to make a difference, just want their government to listen to them and not get in their business, get labeled as right-wing extremists. And I think that's wrong too. So we can call that out and we can do it in a civil way. The reality is that we can't rely on labels and stereotypes to unite us. We've got to focus on the principles.
Well, our culture is moving leftward so fast. I envision it as a river, which, as we know, moves upstream to downstream. And it's always going leftward. So it takes all your energies just to hold on and not be swept away with it. Whereas most of the culture is being swept away. So, 20 years ago, the people who are considered right-wing extremists now were considered, fairly moderate. Even 2008, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton both agreed that marriage is between a man and a woman. Whether they believed it or not, that doesn't matter. They felt that because of where the culture was, that's what they had to say. And now we've, just in a very short time, completely redefined this institution that's been the bedrock of civilization for millennia. So we're changing very fast, and as a party, the Republicans have to figure out what's your identity. Are you going to move with the culture, or are you going to take a firm stand on some things? And I think I see where that's where some of these battle lines are.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I also feel like a lot of the battle lines aren't so much about principle as they are about territory or kind of tribalism.
Hmm.
And I feel like when we focus on territory or tribalism, we really are doing ourselves a disfavor. And that's exactly what Ronald Reagan was trying to discourage. If we want to have a fundamental disagreement about principles, let's have an open, honest conversation about that. But let's not go around trying to exclude some people from the political process or discredit them just on the basis of a stereotype or a label. Um, let's have a real conversation about principle.
Well, that's been the goal of this project, to have conversations with people. Whether I agree with them or not, I just want to hear where people are coming from.
Love
Uh,
it.
I appreciate you taking the time to share your mind and your heart. We're coming on 40 minutes, which is about how long these things have gone. So, is there any other major issues that we haven't covered that you want to make sure you talk about?
Yeah, maybe one thing that I would just like to throw out there for anyone who's listening is that I feel like one of my great strengths as a legislator is that I'm really straightforward with people. I'm not afraid to talk about what I believe and why I believe it. And when I vote my conscience and I keep a record of my no votes and why I voted no when I vote no. And I'm never afraid to talk about that. One of the things that has been a little frustrating for me in this election cycle is that we really haven't had very many debates or forums where there's an opportunity for open discussion. And so there's been just a lot of taking things out of context, even totally misrepresenting the facts about issues. Um, and I think that makes it really challenging for voters to sort things out. But I feel like when you're looking for someone to serve in public office, the ability of that person to always be totally straightforward, to not exaggerate or misrepresent the facts, to shoot straight on issues and what they do or do not affect is really important. And if you don't have that in a public servant, you really don't have anything. It's just fundamental, the whole relationship. So I just want folks to know that's one of my characteristics. I'm always happy to talk about issues, and I've got my cell phone out there. Love to visit with you. Happy to come to a meet and greet, and just appreciate the chance to be face to face and be real.
Yeah, that's in this day and age. It seems like the whole point is just to win, because that kind of is. If you're not in office, you can't advance your policy, so you need to win. But that's kind of created this race to the bottom where we don't need to have a debate, we don't need to have a open discussion of ideas. We just need to find a few clips of our opponent and destroy them with some mailers, and then get out there and make sure we get our people out to vote. It's become a very tactical enterprise rather than an open debate. I'm not sure, is there a way to fix
A
that?
civil process. Yeah. Oh, you know, I I don't know. I know that I keep trying to do my part to have a civil discussion and to stick to principle, help folks understand the things that we're advocating for. And that's really all you can do at the end of the day. And then folks go to the polls.
Oh, any closing thoughts?
You know, I know that it seems discouraging to see the leftward trend in our culture and our society, Brian. But I guess in closing, I just like to leave folks with my comment that true principles don't change and bad ones never work. And so I do believe that even if we stumble around for a while, we're always going to come back to what's true. It might take a little time, but it's still the right place to stay.
Julianne Young, representative from District 30, Seat B. Thank you.